The coffee was still warm when Harold Brennan noticed the stranger's hands. Clean fingernails, soft palms, expensive watch. Everything wrong for a factory worker in Detroit, 1943. As the man leaned over the production blueprints, asking casual questions about shift rotations, Harold's blood ran cold. This wasn't curiosity, this was reconnaissance. And what this spy didn't know would change the course of the war in ways nobody could imagine. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. October 15, 1943, the Consolidated Motors plant in Hammond, Indiana, hummed with the controlled chaos of wartime production. Steam rose from welding stations, sparks flew from assembly lines, and the deafening clatter of machinery drowned out most conversations. It was the perfect cover for secrets. Klaus Weber had spent 3 months perfecting his American accent, studying baseball statistics, and memorizing the layout of Hammond's industrial district. His mission was simple: infiltrate the tank production facility, document their manufacturing capabilities, and report back to Berlin. German intelligence had identified Consolidated Motors as a critical weakness in American armor production, a small operation that couldn't possibly match German engineering efficiency. Weber's forged credentials identified him as Robert Mitchell, a machinist transferred from a shuttered factory in Ohio. His cover story was flawless, his documentation authentic-looking, and his knowledge of manufacturing processes convincing enough to pass casual inspection. What Weber didn't anticipate was Harold Brennan, the floor supervisor with 23 years of factory experience and an eye for details that didn't add up. The morning Weber arrived, Brennan noticed everything. The way he held his tools, the slight hesitation before using American slang, the too careful pronunciation of technical terms. But Brennan said nothing. Instead, he watched. He observed Weber's interest in production schedules, his subtle questions about shift changes, his lingering gaze at shipping manifests. A pattern emerged that made Brennan's stomach tighten with recognition. Meanwhile, Weber was documenting everything. The factory produced M4 Sherman tanks at what seemed like a respectable pace, 12 units per day across 2 shifts. The workers appeared competent, but not exceptional, the machinery standard for American industry, the organization efficient but unremarkable. His reports to Berlin painted a picture of solid but unspectacular production capabilities, nothing that would significantly impact German calculations about American industrial capacity. What Weber failed to notice was the deliberate theater surrounding him. The production numbers he observed were carefully managed. The machinery he saw was only part of the operation. The workers who spoke freely around him had been briefed on exactly what conversations to have within earshot of the new transfer from Ohio. Brennan had alerted plant security within hours of Weber's arrival, but rather than expose the spy immediately, they chose a different approach. Under guidance from military intelligence officers who arrived within days, they decided to feed Weber exactly the information they wanted German command to receive. The deception ran deeper than Weber could imagine. The visible production line represented roughly 30% of the facility's actual capacity. Behind false walls and in underground extensions built during the plant's hasty wartime expansion, additional assembly lines operated around the clock. The 12 tanks Weber counted each day were joined by 36 others he never saw. Consolidated Motors wasn't producing 12 Sherman tanks daily, they were producing 48. But even that number told only part of the story. The Hammond facility was one of 17 plants across the Midwest operating under similar camouflage. Each had been designed to appear smaller and less efficient than reality. Each had been infiltrated by German operatives who were unknowingly being fed misinformation. The cumulative effect was staggering. German intelligence believed American tank production was operating at roughly 1/4 of its actual capacity. Weber's daily routine became predictable. He arrived at 7, worked the morning shift with convincing competence, asked innocent-seeming questions during breaks, and documented everything in a coded journal hidden in his boarding house room. His evening radio transmissions to German handlers painted a consistent picture. American production was steady but limited, vulnerable to disruption, and insufficient to sustain prolonged European operations. The information Weber couldn't access was far more significant. Production schedules that showed continuous 24-hour operations. Shipping records that revealed tank convoys departing every night under cover of darkness. Quality control documents that demonstrated American manufacturing efficiency exceeding German projections by substantial margins. Supply chain logistics that showed raw materials flowing into Hammond at 3 times the rate visible production would require. As weeks passed, Weber grew confident in his assessment. The Americans were doing their best with limited resources and outdated industrial methods. His reports recommended that German forces could expect American armor support to remain constrained by production bottlenecks through at least mid-1944. This intelligence would prove catastrophically wrong, but Weber had no way of knowing that the entire operation he'd been observing was an elaborate facade. The psychological warfare aspect was equally sophisticated. Weber was allowed to overhear carefully staged conversations about production delays, material shortages, and worker morale problems. He witnessed orchestrated arguments between supervisors about impossible deadlines and resource constraints. He saw workers discussing overtime fatigue and equipment failures that never quite seemed to shut down production, but suggested an operation running at maximum sustainable capacity.
What Weber interpreted as American industrial struggles were actually indicators of an operation running so efficiently that artificial problems had to be created to make the deception believable. The real challenge for Brennan and his team wasn't increasing production. It was hiding just how dramatically they'd exceeded every projection, while making it appear they were barely meeting minimum requirements. The trap was perfect, comprehensive, and utterly convincing. Weber had no reason to suspect that his entire intelligence operation was being orchestrated by the very people he was spying on. His reports flowed back to Berlin with confidence and detail that made them completely credible to German planners who desperately wanted to believe that American production capabilities remained manageable. But hidden beneath Hammond's carefully constructed facade, the real story of American wartime production was unfolding at a pace and scale that would reshape the entire conflict. The question wasn't whether German intelligence would discover the deception. It was how catastrophically wrong their miscalculations would prove to be when American armor began arriving on European battlefields in numbers that defied every German strategic assumption. November 3rd, 1943. 3 floors beneath the Consolidated Motors plant, a different kind of war was being fought. The underground assembly lines never appeared on any blueprint Weber could access, never showed up in shipping manifests he glimpsed, and operated on a schedule that defied every assumption about American industrial capacity. Margaret Caldwell descended the concealed staircase at 11:47 p.m., her security badge granting access to sections of the facility that officially didn't exist. As night shift supervisor for the covert operations, she oversaw production numbers that would have sent shockwaves through German high command. While Weber documented 12 tanks rolling off visible assembly lines each day, Caldwell's teams were completing 36 additional units in spaces carved out during the plant's rapid wartime expansion. The deception required extraordinary coordination. Every rivet, every weld, every component had to be accounted for without creating discrepancies that might attract attention. Raw steel arrived in shipments marked for standard production, but 30% was immediately diverted through hidden loading docks to underground facilities. Finished tanks rolled out through camouflaged exits, loaded onto trains that departed during shift changes when the fewest eyes were watching. Frank Garrison managed the logistics that made the routine impossible. His shipping department maintained 2 completely separate sets of records. The sanitized versions accessible to anyone with basic clearance, and the classified documentation that tracked the facility's true output. Every night, convoys of Sherman tanks departed Hammond under cover of darkness, following routes mapped specifically to avoid German surveillance networks that American counterintelligence had identified throughout the Midwest. The psychological pressure on workers involved in the covert operation was immense. They couldn't discuss their work with family members, couldn't celebrate production milestones, couldn't even acknowledge the scale of their contribution to the war effort. Dorothy Fleming, a welder on the underground third shift, had been working 14-hour days for months while maintaining the fiction that she only worked standard 8-hour shifts. Her husband believed she was earning overtime pay doing maintenance work. The truth would have to wait until after the war. Weber's intelligence gathering had become more sophisticated as his confidence grew. He'd developed relationships with workers who seemed trustworthy, cultivated sources who provided information about production schedules and supply deliveries. What he didn't realize was that every source had been carefully selected, every piece of information meticulously crafted to reinforce German assumptions about limited American manufacturing capabilities. The facility's design supported the deception at every level. Electrical consumption was masked through connections to nearby industrial operations. Ventilation systems were camouflaged as standard factory infrastructure. Even the sounds of additional production were muffled through acoustic engineering that redirected noise signatures to match expected patterns for the facility's reported capacity. Military Intelligence Officer Captain James Thornton coordinated the broader deception from an office disguised as routine administrative space. His operation extended far beyond Hammond, managing similar misdirection campaigns at production facilities across 17 states. The cumulative effect represented the largest industrial counterintelligence operation in American history, designed to ensure German strategic planning remained based on catastrophically inaccurate assumptions. The technical challenges were staggering. Quality control for covert production had to match standards for visible manufacturing while operating under conditions of absolute secrecy. Testing procedures, documentation protocols, and safety inspections all required duplicate systems that could function independently without creating evidence trails. Every tank produced in the hidden facilities underwent identical inspection processes, but the paperwork vanished into classified filing systems that wouldn't be declassified for decades. Weber began noticing subtle inconsistencies that troubled him without triggering immediate alarm. Shipping schedules that seemed slightly irregular, worker conversations that mentioned colleagues he'd never encountered, supply deliveries that appeared larger than visible production would require. But each discrepancy had a reasonable explanation that prevented deeper investigation.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The financial complexity of the covert operation required unprecedented cooperation between government agencies and private industry. Consolidated Motors maintained standard accounting for its reported production while managing completely separate financial streams for classified manufacturing. Component suppliers delivered materials through networks that obscured final destinations. Even routine maintenance contracts were structured to hide the facility's true operational scope. Eleanor Hayes supervised quality assurance for both visible and hidden production lines, ensuring that standards remained consistent across all manufacturing. Her teams worked in shifts that never overlapped with standard operations, using equipment that was technically identical but operated under different protocols. The precision required to maintain dual production standards without creating detectable variations demanded expertise that pushed American manufacturing capabilities to new levels. The human cost of maintaining such elaborate deception was substantial but rarely acknowledged. Workers' families noticed irregular schedules, unexplained fatigue, and stress levels that seemed disproportionate to standard factory work. Community members observed increased industrial activity that didn't match official production reports. Local businesses saw customer patterns that suggested larger workforce numbers than publicly acknowledged. Weber's handlers in Berlin were impressed with the consistent intelligence flowing from Hammond. His reports painted a detailed picture of American industrial operations that confirmed German strategic assumptions about manageable production levels. The information was so comprehensive and internally consistent that it became foundational to German planning for extended European operations. What German intelligence couldn't anticipate was the scale of coordination required to maintain such successful deception. American counterintelligence had identified and was monitoring German spy networks across the industrial Midwest, feeding carefully crafted misinformation through multiple sources to create the illusion of independent verification. Weber wasn't just receiving false information, he was part of a larger network of compromised agents, unknowingly reinforcing the same strategic deceptions. The underground facilities at Hammond represented only a fraction of America's hidden production capacity. Similar operations across the country were generating military equipment at rates that exceeded German projections by margins that would fundamentally alter the war's trajectory. But for the deception to remain effective, even American military planners were compartmentalized, with many officials unaware of the true scope of covert production capabilities. As November progressed, Weber's confidence in his intelligence gathering reached new heights. He'd developed what seemed like a comprehensive understanding of American tank production capabilities, complete with detailed documentation and multiple source verification. His reports to Berlin carried weight that would influence German strategic decisions for months to come. The trap was complete, comprehensive, and about to pay devastating dividends that neither Weber nor his handlers could imagine. December 12, 1943. Weber's radio crackled with urgent static as he attempted his nightly transmission from the boarding house room on Maple Street. For 3 consecutive nights, his signals had been met with silence from Berlin handlers, who typically responded within minutes. What Weber couldn't know was that American codebreakers had finally cracked the encryption protocols used by German spy networks across the industrial Midwest, and his entire communication system had been compromised for weeks. Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Sinclair studied the decoded transmissions from her office in the War Department's most classified wing. Weber's reports revealed more than he intended, not just what he observed at Hammond, but how German intelligence was interpreting information from similar operations across 17 states. The pattern emerging from intercepted communications showed German strategic planning was becoming dangerously dependent on misinformation that American counterintelligence had carefully crafted. Weber's growing anxiety wasn't paranoia. Harold Brennan had begun introducing subtle changes to the plant's routine, testing whether the spy would notice discrepancies that might force him to investigate more deeply. A shipment arriving at an unusual hour, a conversation between supervisors about equipment that didn't match what Weber had documented. Small inconsistencies designed to probe how carefully he was actually observing versus how much he was assuming. The test revealed Weber's critical weakness. Rather than investigating anomalies that challenged his established understanding, he dismissed details that didn't fit his preconceived assessment of American production capabilities. His confidence in German technological superiority had created blind spots that prevented him from recognizing evidence contradicting his reports to Berlin. Meanwhile, the covert production network was approaching capacity that would have staggered German planners. Vincent Müller, the plant's true production manager, coordinated operations that were completing over 60 Sherman tanks daily across all shifts and hidden facilities. The numbers represented manufacturing efficiency that exceeded German projections for American industrial capacity by margins that would reshape strategic calculations about the war's duration. Weber's isolation was becoming complete without his awareness. His boarding house was under constant surveillance by agents posing as residents and local business owners. His favorite diner was staffed with waitresses who reported every conversation. Even the barber who cut his hair monthly was feeding information to American intelligence about topics Weber discussed during supposedly casual conversation. The psychological operation had evolved beyond simple misdirection. American counterintelligence was using Weber to test German intelligence responses to different types of misinformation. When his reports included specific technical details, how did Berlin react? When he mentioned production delays, did German strategic planning adjust accordingly? Weber had become an unwitting laboratory for understanding enemy decision-making processes. Dr. Robert Ashford, a specialist in industrial psychology consulting for the War Department, had designed protocols for managing the emotional strain on American workers maintaining the deception. The psychological cost of operating such elaborate secrecy was creating unexpected challenges that threatened to expose the operation through behavioral changes in personnel involved in covert production. Weber's social connections in Hammond had been carefully cultivated to reinforce his preconceptions about American industrial limitations. The workers who befriended him shared stories about equipment failures, supply shortages, and management incompetence that painted a picture of American manufacturing struggling with wartime demands. Every anecdote was crafted to support German assumptions about superior European industrial organization. The technical sophistication of the American deception was reaching levels that impressed even its architects. Engineers had developed sound masking systems that could simulate production noise patterns for different equipment configurations, allowing covert facilities to operate at full capacity while generating acoustic signatures matching much smaller operations. Visual camouflage had evolved to include detailed mock-ups of equipment that appeared functional but were actually concealing entirely different machinery. Weber's handlers in Berlin were beginning to express concerns about American industrial potential that his reports hadn't anticipated. Intercepted German communications revealed growing anxiety about discrepancies between projected American production capabilities and actual equipment appearing on European battlefields. But Weber's consistently detailed reports provided reassurance that American manufacturing remained within manageable parameters. The logistical masterpiece required to maintain dual production systems was pushing American industrial innovation in directions that would influence post-war manufacturing development. Scheduling algorithms developed to coordinate visible and hidden operations without creating detectable patterns were advancing computational methods that wouldn't become widespread in civilian industry for decades. Catherine Brenner, an accountant managing financial documentation for the covert operation, had developed accounting protocols that allowed Consolidated Motors to report standard profits while generating revenue from classified production that couldn't appear in public financial statements. The complexity required unprecedented cooperation between private industry and government agencies that was redefining relationships between corporate and military interests. Weber's personal life was becoming increasingly strained by the isolation required for his mission. He'd been instructed to avoid romantic relationships, limit social connections, and maintain emotional distance from American colleagues. The psychological pressure was intensifying his reliance on the validation he received from Berlin when his intelligence reports were praised for their thoroughness and accuracy. What Weber couldn't perceive was that his entire understanding of American industrial capacity was systematically inverted. Every conclusion he'd drawn about production limitations was contradicted by reality. Every assessment of American technological capabilities was undermined by innovations he'd never encountered. Every strategic recommendation he'd transmitted to Berlin was based on evidence that had been deliberately fabricated to mislead German planning. The trap was closing with precision that would have impressed German intelligence officers who had trained Weber in surveillance and deception techniques. American counterintelligence had learned from European espionage methods and improved upon them to create operations whose sophistication exceeded anything previously attempted in industrial warfare. As December progressed, Weber's confidence remained unshaken, while his entire intelligence network was being systematically dismantled by American agents who had been monitoring German spy operations across multiple states. The information flowing to Berlin continued painting pictures of American industrial struggles that would prove catastrophically inaccurate when the true scale of wartime production became apparent on European battlefields. The final phase of the deception was about to begin, and Weber had no indication that his carefully constructed understanding of American capabilities was about to be revealed as one of the most successful counterintelligence operations in military history. January 18, 1944. The photograph arrived in Berlin through diplomatic channels that bypassed every security protocol German intelligence had established. American tanks were rolling through the streets of Naples in numbers that made Weber's production reports seem like fiction. General Heinrich Müller stared at reconnaissance images showing Sherman formations that exceeded every projection based on intelligence from the American industrial heartland. Weber remained oblivious to the crisis his reports had created. His morning routine at Consolidated Motors continued unchanged, documenting the same 12 tanks per day, the same production struggles, the same evidence of American industrial limitations that had formed the foundation of German strategic planning for the European theater. But in Berlin, emergency meetings were questioning everything German intelligence thought it knew about American manufacturing capacity. The breaking point came from an unexpected source. SS Oberfuhrer Karl Hoffmann, analyzing shipping manifests captured from Allied convoys, discovered serial numbers on American tanks that suggested production rates impossibly higher than any German spy had reported. The mathematical implications were staggering. If the serial number sequences were accurate, American tank production was operating at nearly 4 times the capacity that German intelligence had calculated.
Colonel Amanda Richardson received the flash message from European theater commanders at 0347 hours. German forces were encountering American armor in quantities that defied every intelligence assessment about industrial production limitations. The carefully constructed deception was beginning to collapse under the weight of battlefield reality, but the damage to German strategic planning had already been catastrophic. Weber's world began unraveling during what seemed like a routine morning shift. Harold Brennan approached his workstation with an expression that immediately triggered alarm. Instead of the usual casual conversation about production schedules, Brennan handed him a manila envelope containing photographs that Weber recognized with growing horror, detailed images of the underground facilities he'd never suspected existed. The photographs showed assembly lines operating at full capacity 3 levels below the factory floor where Weber had been working for months. Timestamps indicated round-the-clock production that would have tripled his estimates of Consolidated Motors' manufacturing capabilities. But the images represented only a fraction of the deception that had been orchestrated around his intelligence gathering. Major Daniel Crawford, the military intelligence officer who had been coordinating Weber's surveillance since November, stepped from behind a machinery assembly with documentation that made Weber's blood freeze. Radio transcripts of every transmission he'd sent to Berlin, decoded copies of his encrypted reports, detailed analyses of how German strategic planning had adjusted based on misinformation he'd unknowingly provided. The scope of the operation was beyond anything Weber had imagined possible. Maps showing 17 similar facilities across the Midwest, each running identical deceptions that had compromised German intelligence assessments of American industrial capacity. Production figures that revealed actual tank manufacturing rates exceeding German projections by margins that would fundamentally alter the war's timeline. Weber's arrest was conducted with professional courtesy that emphasized how completely his mission had been compromised. Crawford explained that every aspect of his intelligence operation had been monitored, controlled, and exploited to feed misinformation to German command. The workers he'd cultivated as sources, the production schedules he'd documented, the technical assessments he'd transmitted, everything had been carefully orchestrated to mislead German strategic planning. The psychological impact on Weber was devastating. Months of meticulous intelligence gathering had not only failed but had actively contributed to German miscalculations about American capabilities. His detailed reports had provided false confidence that American production remained manageable, while actual manufacturing capacity was reaching levels that would overwhelm German defensive preparations in Europe. Meanwhile, the true scale of American production was becoming apparent to German commanders facing Sherman tanks that appeared on battlefields faster than their intelligence had suggested was possible. The industrial deception that had begun in facilities like Hammond was revealing its strategic impact through armor concentrations that German forces were unprepared to counter. Lieutenant Sarah Morrison, analyzing intercepted German communications, observed panic spreading through enemy intelligence networks as field reports contradicted every assessment about American industrial limitations. German strategic planners were desperately trying to reconcile battlefield reality with intelligence that had consistently underestimated American manufacturing by catastrophic margins. The Hammond facility's covert production had been just one component of an industrial effort that was reshaping the global balance of military power. While Weber had documented 12 tanks daily, the combined American production network was completing over 800 Sherman tanks every 24 hours across facilities that German intelligence had never suspected existed. Weber's interrogation revealed the extent to which German strategic planning had become dependent on misinformation provided by compromised spy networks. His reports had influenced decisions about troop deployments, defensive preparations, and resource allocation that were proving disastrously inadequate when confronted with actual American production capabilities. The deception's success was measured not just in tanks produced, but in German strategic miscalculations that were compounding across multiple theaters. Enemy forces that had planned defensive operations based on limited American armor support were encountering Sherman formations that overwhelmed prepared positions through sheer numerical superiority. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a psychiatrist studying the psychological effects of extended deception operations, documented the emotional trauma experienced by German agents who discovered their intelligence gathering had been systematically exploited. Weber's case became a textbook example of how successful counterintelligence could turn enemy assets into unwitting tools of strategic misdirection. The industrial achievement represented by the covert production network extended far beyond military applications. Manufacturing techniques developed to maintain dual production systems were advancing American industrial capabilities in ways that would influence post-war economic development for decades. As Weber was transported to a secure facility for extended debriefing, the tanks he'd never known existed were rolling off assembly lines towards European battlefields where they would demonstrate the devastating effectiveness of the most successful industrial counterintelligence operation in modern warfare history.
March 15, 1944. The Normandy invasion plans being finalized in London included armor concentrations that would have been impossible without the industrial deception that had consumed Weber's intelligence mission. General Dwight Eisenhower reviewed deployment schedules showing Sherman tank availability that exceeded every pre-war projection about American manufacturing potential. The numbers represented a strategic advantage that German forces had no preparation to counter. Weber sat in a secure interrogation facility outside Washington, providing details that helped American intelligence understand how thoroughly German strategic planning had been compromised. His debriefings revealed that Berlin's entire approach to defending occupied Europe was based on assumptions about limited American armor support that bore no relationship to actual production capabilities. The psychological destruction of German intelligence networks was spreading beyond individual agents. Brigadier General Otto Brenner, coordinating German defensive preparations in France, was receiving reports about American industrial capacity that contradicted everything his intelligence services had provided for over a year. The discrepancies were so dramatic that German command was questioning whether their entire intelligence apparatus had been systematically compromised. At Hammond, the covert production facilities emerged from secrecy with celebration that had been suppressed for months. Workers like Dorothy Fleming could finally acknowledge the scale of their contribution to the war effort. The underground assembly lines that had operated in absolute secrecy were revealed as technological marvels that had advanced American manufacturing capabilities far beyond pre-war levels. Margaret Caldwell, promoted to oversee the transition from covert to open production, coordinated the integration of hidden facilities with standard operations. The manufacturing efficiency achieved under conditions of extreme secrecy was being applied to expanded production that would sustain American forces through the final phases of the European campaign. The strategic impact was becoming apparent across multiple theaters simultaneously. In the Pacific, American armor was appearing in quantities that Japanese intelligence had calculated as impossible based on assessments of industrial capacity. The deception network that had misled German planning had also compromised Axis understanding of American production potential across global operations. Dr. Charles Whitman, analyzing the long-term effects of the industrial counterintelligence program, documented innovations in manufacturing coordination that were revolutionizing American industrial organization. Techniques developed to manage dual production systems were being adapted for civilian applications that would drive post-war economic expansion. Weber's case study became required reading for intelligence officers training in counter-espionage techniques. His thoroughness in documenting misinformation had provided textbook examples of how successful deception operations could manipulate enemy strategic planning through carefully controlled intelligence channels.
The human cost of the operation was finally being acknowledged. Families like those of Frank Garrison and Eleanor Hayes learned about the classified work their relatives had been performing for months. The psychological strain of maintaining absolute secrecy while contributing to efforts that would determine the war's outcome had created emotional challenges that extended far beyond the factory workers directly involved. General George Marshall, reviewing after-action reports from European operations, noted that German defensive preparations had consistently underestimated American armor concentrations by margins that suggested systematic intelligence failures rather than isolated miscalculations. The industrial deception program had achieved strategic effects that exceeded every projection about its potential. The technological innovations emerging from covert production facilities were being transferred to civilian manufacturing sectors where they would influence American industrial development for decades. Assembly line coordination techniques, quality control protocols, and logistical management systems developed under conditions of absolute secrecy were proving applicable to peacetime production challenges. Lieutenant Colonel Patricia Sinclair was analyzing intercepted German communications that revealed the scope of strategic confusion created by compromised intelligence networks. German military planners were attempting to reconcile battlefield reality with assessments that had consistently underestimated American capabilities by catastrophic margins. The Hammond facility became a symbol of industrial achievement that had been hidden from public recognition during its most critical period. Workers who had maintained the deception under extreme psychological pressure were finally receiving acknowledgement for contributions that had fundamentally altered the war's trajectory. Weber's intelligence reports were being studied by military historians as examples of how confirmation bias could blind trained operatives to evidence that contradicted their preconceptions. His confidence in German technological superiority had created vulnerabilities that American counterintelligence had exploited with devastating effectiveness. The production numbers being declassified revealed manufacturing achievements that surprised even American military planners. The network of facilities operating under elaborate deception had exceeded every projection about wartime industrial potential while maintaining complete secrecy about their actual capabilities. Captain James Thornton received commendations for coordinating deception operations that had influenced enemy strategic planning across multiple theaters. The program he had managed represented one of the most successful counterintelligence achievements in military history, with effects that would be studied by intelligence services for generations.
The economic implications of the covert production network were reshaping understanding of American industrial potential. Manufacturing capacity that had been developed under wartime secrecy was being converted to civilian applications that would drive unprecedented economic growth in the post-war period. Weber's personal journey from confident intelligence operative to unwitting tool of enemy deception became a cautionary tale about the vulnerabilities created by overconfidence in preconceived assessments. His case demonstrated how successful counterintelligence could turn enemy assets into sources of strategic misinformation. The legacy of the Hammond deception extended beyond military applications to influence civilian manufacturing throughout the American economy. Innovations in production coordination, quality control, and logistics management developed under conditions of absolute secrecy were being adapted for peacetime industries that would define America's post-war prosperity. As Allied forces prepared for operations that would rely on armor concentrations German intelligence had calculated as impossible, the true measure of the deception's success was becoming apparent. Weber's intelligence reports had contributed to enemy miscalculations that would prove decisive in determining the war's outcome. The price of deception had been paid in full, but not by those who had orchestrated it.
German strategic planning, based on intelligence that bore no relationship to American industrial reality, was about to confront the devastating consequences of having been systematically misled about their enemy's true capabilities. The tanks rolling toward European battlefields carried more than armor and ammunition. They represented the triumph of industrial deception that had turned enemy intelligence operations into instruments of their own strategic defeat. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.